Thanks very much for joining us this evening. My name is Stefan Haggard. I'm the Associate Director of the Korea Pacific Program here at the School of Global Policy and Strategy. We're just going to leave 1 minute for people to enter the webinar. Okay, why don't we get started? Curtis, do you have a slide for our event next Monday? Thanks. Yeah, before we get started with this evening's program, I just want to tell people about a program that's coming up on next Monday online. And the South Korean government at the municipal level has been experimenting with gender quotas. And we're going to be doing a seminar on the effect of those gender quotas on perceptions of women's role in Korean society. So it's a really interesting political issue, and we've got some good research on that. Tonight, I'm really pleased to introduce Joel Witt, and I can't help starting with the first page of his new book called Fallout. He's being held at a military compound near the North Korean-Chinese border on the North Korean side because he's there as an inspector trying to figure out whether the North Koreans have violated an agreement which they had recently signed called the Agreed Framework. And so Joel's experience is not secondhand, it is firsthand, and he just has a long and distinguished career in this area. I'll just mention a couple of other things. I brought some props, Joel. Joel is the author with Daniel Kahneman and Robert Gallucci of an excellent book on the first North Korean nuclear crisis called Going Critical, which is as deeply researched and rich as this new book, which just dropped, called Fallout. And I have to say, I don't think I've read anything like this. It's just an incredibly rich account of what's happened going back to the agreed framework, walking all the way forward through the Bush, Obama, first Trump, second Trump, and Biden administrations. And so it's just a really interesting account. Let me just say a few more words about Joel's career before I hand it over to him. He was working on negotiations with the North Koreans going all the way back to the Agreed Framework in 1994. He was responsible for implementing the elements of that program, and in retrospect, that deal looks much better than some people thought at the time. He left the government, and I don't know if this is cause and effect, in 2002 when the Bush administration took some actions that ended up blowing up that deal. And then he's been a senior fellow since at a variety of prestigious institutions, including the Stimson Center now, CSIS, and Johns Hopkins SAIS. But I think the one thing that I was really struck by in the book, and having intersected with Joel at a number of points, is he's very deeply embedded in the community of practitioners who talk to the North Koreans informally through track 1.5 and track 2 channels. And one of the fascinating parts of this book is just the story of those track 2 interactions and how dense they are, and how important they are for understanding what the North Koreans are actually thinking, particularly when diplomacy is not working or not even being tried. So what we're going to do tonight is Joel's going to talk about the book for 15, 20, 30 minutes. We'll have a little bit of a conversation. And then any of you who would like to post questions, please do it in the Q&A. And I'll try to moderate that discussion and get Joel to answer your questions. Joel, welcome to UCSD's Korea Pacific program. Thanks for doing this for us.
Thanks a lot, Steph. I really appreciate your comments, and I'm glad you enjoyed the book. It took me 6 years to research and write this. And I started out, I didn't want to just write an academic book. I wanted to really go into the rooms where it happened. And that included diplomacy, it included in the halls of power in Washington and elsewhere. It included meetings between spies, secret meetings between spies, and it included military preparations for possible confrontations with North Korea. And not only did I want to do that, but I wanted to populate the narrative with, everyone imaginable, world leaders, Donald Trump, Barack Obama, diplomats, generals, bureaucrats, smugglers, and spies. And I'm glad to hear your comments. It sounds like I may have succeeded in doing all that. The book is about, as the title says, it's about how North Korea built nuclear armed missiles able to destroy American cities in less than 30 minutes. And it's about how did the US fail to stop North Korea from doing that? And that's a question that Donald Trump repeatedly asked his advisors and world leaders during his first term. And, a lot of people know about the meeting between Trump and Obama, President Obama, when Trump won the election. What's not well known is Obama made North Korea a centerpiece of this discussion. And he told Trump he had asked the Pentagon to prepare for a preemptive attack, not because he was going to do it, but because he was so concerned that North Korea in the future might launch nuclear missiles, that he wanted to be prepared for that. And it turned out he scared Trump. And I think that was a big part of why Trump made it a priority for his administration. Let me first start before I get into the US administrations. I wanted to take a step back and look at the right prism to view what North Korea was about and what the United States was about. And, my experience with the North Koreans, had nothing to do with ideology or they're not robots. It had to do with the centrality of geopolitics in their strategy. And you could see that in many ways. For example, when the North Koreans would visit New York, either to go to the UN or Track 2 meetings, they always made sure they'd meet with Henry Kissinger, who, of course, was the grand master of international politics. So this geopolitical hunt involved seeking better relations with the United States, and the nuclear weapons program was on the chopping block. And the hunt started in the early 1990s, and it's pretty clear why. The Soviet Union collapsed, one of North Korea's main allies. The Chinese were reaching out to South Korea, one of North Korea's, probably its main enemy. And North Korea decided, and we have information on this, that it would be best to approach the United States to see if it could offset the deteriorating geopolitical situation. And what's also missed by many analysts is throughout these 30 years, there's been a domestic theme that pops up occasionally. And that is that North Korean leaders want to modernize their economy. They want to reduce the enormous military budget and get assistance. So what's the answer to President Trump's question? How did this happen? And I think the short answer is that, US policy for 30 years has been bedeviled by miscalculations, misunderstandings, and myths. And this isn't unique to our policy towards North Korea. We've seen it in the case of Vietnam. We've seen it, all the way up to Iraq and Afghanistan. And a big part of this is we overrate our ability to influence other countries. And we fail to understand them and what shapes their behavior. But, look, North Korea also has to shoulder some of the blame here. They may have made the switch from confrontation to accommodation, but that wasn't easy for them. And so there were times when they shifted to thinking it was better for them to have their own nuclear weapons. And a lot of the time, when you see the provocations, periodic provocations, I believe that was not only to develop arsenals that would serve as a hedge, but also it was part of their own strategy of coercive diplomacy. So, Steph has said I've gone through the whole history. I'm not going to do that tonight. Most of the book is on Obama and Trump, the two terms of Obama and Trump's first term. And, the Obama administration is an interesting case because President Obama entered office saying he would reach out to dictators abroad. But it became very clear that the Obama administration pressed the default button and moved to a strategy of strategic patience, which was calculated pressure to change bad behavior and bring North Korea back to the negotiating table. That was the strategy that dominated the administration for most of its 8 years. And I'm not going to go through all those 8 years, but it's interesting because, one of the interviews I did was with a senior White House official in the last year of the Obama administration. And she told me that North Korea policy had gone through 5 stages of grief: denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance. And, that sort of says it all. The administration really didn't bring much pressure on North Korea. The sanctions it enacted until the last year were limited and not effective at all. And, the administration tried other things like President Obama, when he saw the threat was growing, as I said earlier, ordered the Pentagon to come up with a plan for a preemptive strike. Well, that didn't work out because it's hard to find mobile missiles. And of course, North Korea had the ultimate recourse to starting a war with South Korea. And it's interesting, one of Obama's aides told me he was pretty unhappy not getting the right answer. And he said to people, if the US can find Osama bin Laden, it should be able to find North Korean mobile missiles. Another avenue it pursued was a concerted push with China. And this happened near the end of the administration, the second term, because it was interesting. Xi Jinping was very different from previous Chinese leaders, and he openly expressed his disdain for Kim Jong-un. And the Americans initially thought, well, gee, maybe we can get him to really put pressure on North Korea. But when push came to shove, he wasn't willing to do that. And so in the last 2 years of the administration, Susan Rice led an effort to really step up engaging China on this issue, to put more pressure on China to do the right thing, but also offering them the other side of the ledger. So, for example, I think there were talks with the Chinese on reducing the American military posture in South Korea and maybe even in the region. And lastly, and I'm not going to go through every one of these opportunities, but there were multiple missed diplomatic opportunities throughout the administration. And it started in 2009 when Bill Clinton visited Pyongyang and met with Kim Jong-il. There were opportunities that came out of that weren't capitalized on. We can talk about the 2012 Leap Day deal, which I think was a big mistake on the part of the administration to even reach that deal. And then when they tried to somehow salvage it, they made more missteps. And then in the second term, there were opportunities every year, 2013, 2014, 2015, 2016. Every year there was an opportunity to sit down and talk with the North Koreans, but the administration never did that. And, one senior White House official told me when the second term came around, the attitude was, we're not going to deal with those assholes anymore. So, by the time you get to the end of the administration, President Obama was extremely frustrated and decided that, look, we need to sit down with these guys and reach a deal. But we never really got to that point because time ran out. So, okay, what about the next administration, Donald Trump? Well, it wasn't a slow motion failure like it was under Obama. I mean, you can pinpoint the points where the failures really happened. And I'm just going to talk about those, which were the Hanoi summit, which everyone knows about, that ended in failure, and the DMZ summit a few months afterwards, which to all appearances was a success, but in fact it was a disaster. So starting with Hanoi, there are a number of myths about Hanoi that I wanted to explode. And one of the myths was, oh God, it was a complete failure. Well, in fact, it wasn't a complete failure because in the run-up to the summit, the US and North Korea negotiated what I was told was a 10-page summit declaration that resolved every issue the US and North Korea had been negotiating on for decades, ranging from establishing diplomatic relations to beginning peace treaty talks. Now, those issues were in that summit declaration, but there were blank spaces for two issues. One, what would be the extent of denuclearization? And two, what kind of sanctions was the US willing to lift? And that gets me to the second myth. A lot of people say, well, Hanoi failed because Trump wanted complete denuclearization and the North Koreans weren't willing to offer it. Well, that's not true. Trump didn't push for a complete denuclearization. Trump was more than willing to work with Kim on what is called a small package, some denuclearization in return for some sanctions lifting. And he tried that. He tried it sitting at the table with Kim, but a lot of people don't have experience dealing with North Koreans. They're going to stake out their maximum position in the beginning. They're not going to give in right away. And so Kim's maximum position was he would agree to dismantle the Yonbyon nuclear facility, which had a number of key installations, but not all, that wasn't his whole program. And in return, he wanted all sanctions lifted. And Trump wasn't going to do that. So he pushed Kim to either give him more on the nuclear front or demand less on the sanctions front. And Kim wouldn't budge. And, John Bolton goes through this in his book, too. So most people who have the stomach to read his book would see that. So Trump, being Trump, his nickname was the 2-minute man. And Anthony Fauci said he had the patience of a kindergartner. Trump decided he was going to walk out. He wasn't going to stay for the whole summit. But in the meantime, as this was going on, Steve Biegun, who was the main U.S. negotiator, was meeting with a senior North Korean official in the hallway outside the meeting room, and they were making progress on the nuclear part of the deal and on the sanctions part of the deal. But the problem was, as they were talking, Trump walked by and he walked out the door of the hotel. And all the Americans had to follow him. And that cut any chance of a deal short. So I'm not saying there would have been a deal, but there certainly was a chance there would have been a deal. And, and I'm not sure what Trump was thinking, of course, when he got on Air Force One. But when he got on Air Force One, he called President Moon of South Korea. And he asked him to contact Kim Jong-un and find out how he was feeling. And he asked him 7 times. So, I'm not sure if Trump had some doubts about whether he should have walked out or not. And it was pretty clear how Kim was feeling, because he went back to his hotel and slammed the door to his room. So that's the story of Hanoi. And there's one other myth I want to explode here. There's a lot of talk about how John Bolton somehow magically influenced Trump to then the result of the summit. Well, that just wasn't true at all. In fact, John Bolton had been cut out of decision-making months earlier by Mike Pompeo, who was the Secretary of State, and Steve Biegun. And Bolton made one last try, one of his aides made one last try to sell the Libya model, Bolton's denuclearization deal, to Trump on Air Force One as they were flying to Hanoi, and Trump rejected it. And then in the meeting, this is interesting, Trump evidently had a piece of paper with the Libya model in his back pocket. And at one point in the meeting, he took it out, threw it at Kim and said, "Take a look, see what you think." But Trump never raised it again. So, I think Bolton really had very little influence on Trump's approach to the summit. And the approach, I think, was the right one. But, as far as I'm concerned, the summit failed because Trump didn't stay the whole day. On the DMZ summit, once again, very interesting, Trump's approach, tweeting when he was in Japan that he wanted to meet Kim. The two of them met at the DMZ. It was really, the BBC said it was classic Trump stage management. But in fact, the meeting was, I said earlier, a disaster. And it was a disaster because Trump promised Kim that he would cancel an upcoming U.S.-South Korean military exercise. And he didn't. The exercise went ahead. And Kim was very angry about that. And we know that because we have access to the 27 letters the two of them exchanged over a year. And the last letter was extremely angry. And that essentially ended the Trump administration's chances. And, when COVID hit, that ended it for good. I'm not going to go into the Biden administration. Everyone knows not much happened there. And I just want to say one or two words on where we are today. And, there's been a lot of talk about maybe Trump was going to meet Kim again. He still wants to meet Kim. And, I'm all for diplomacy, and the situation has certainly got a lot worse since 2019 in terms of the escalating arms race, in terms of North Korea's hostility to South Korea. And also, North Korea is a very different country today. And I say that because of its relationship with Russia and China. Kim Jong-un is modernizing his conventional forces. He's modernizing his defense industry. And it looks to many people like he's preparing for an eventual war. I don't know if that's true or not, but certainly it's not a good situation. So the last point I want to make is, as a supporter of diplomacy, and certainly I supported Donald Trump's approach in his first term, I'm not so sure a summit in his second term is such a good idea. And I say that mainly for two reasons. First of all, Trump seems to think like he can just pick up where he left off in 2019. And the situation has totally changed since then. And secondly, in the past, in the first term, he had good advisors who were steering him towards the right approach. Now, I don't see any advisors. And he said publicly that he knows Kim Jong-un better than anyone else. So he's not likely to be open to advice. And then on the other side of the coin, there's Kim Jong-un, as I said earlier. He's in a very different spot today than he was in 2019. He feels strengthened. He has allies now, Russia and China. Sanctions aren't biting. He's hostile towards South Korea. And I think one of his big objectives is to try to push the United States out of Northeast Asia. And that's certainly a Chinese objective and probably a Russian objective. And I think the danger is Trump might fall for it. I think in a meeting, Trump is certainly going to agree to cancel US ROK joint exercises. But, it's quite possible Kim may say to Trump, in the interest of peaceful coexistence, why don't you start withdrawing troops from South Korea? And I'm sure, Kim would offer him something in return, but I think that would help him achieve his big objective. And Trump might bite. He might say, yeah, that's going to save us a lot of money. So let me stop on that, I guess, gloomy note. And I'll turn it over to you, Steph.
Joel, thanks. I mean, that's really a masterful account of the book because the themes that you talk about in the Obama and Trump administrations run through the earlier periods as well. Let me dive in with a few hypotheses and let you talk about them because I think they're part of the lore. I mean, one thing that obviously goes wrong is this belief that sanctions are going to magically solve all your problems, and that the North Koreans are just going to wake up some morning and decide, oh, we're in trouble, after managing to survive the famine and other shortages, to think that that's going to turn the trick. I mean, it might have influenced things a little bit in 2017, 18 with the Chinese signing on to tariffs, but I think we would probably agree on that one. But let me try a couple of other ideas that strike me as sort of fundamental problems in negotiating with a regime like this. One is that it's extremely hard for both Trump, but particularly Kim Jong-un, to delegate to his negotiators. And so you can get negotiation on some things, but when you get to the big issues, like shutting down Yongbyon versus the sanctions, Kim has to make that decision personally. But when he does it, he didn't seem prepared to manage the details of what shutting down Yongbyon would look like. And obviously, you can lift sanctions with a stroke of a pen. Companies and traders may not respond to that because they still think it's a bad place to do business, but you can do that, in a stroke. But shutting down Yongbyon is Sig Hecker has said this, I think you've said it, it's a 10-year proposition. And so you're sort
Semantically,
of
yeah.
stuck, between something where the concession which is being offered is very, can be done quickly on one side, but implementation on the other side, or even defining what it would be, is much more complicated.
Well, yeah, you're absolutely right. I mean, there are a lot of technical issues involved, and you would think that, Kim Jong-un wouldn't understand them, but I think he had an understanding of the technical issues. That's the first point I want to make. And I say that because, in this hallway negotiation that I mentioned, one of the big questions Steve Biegun couldn't get negotiators to answer was they had to define what Yanbian meant.
Mhm.
What were the boundaries of the facility?
Which building? Yeah.
And Steve wanted the whole facility. So he said that to his counterpart, who was Chae Sun-hee, who's now the North Korean foreign minister. And she didn't know the answer. So she took a break, went back to the meeting room, the North Korean meeting room. And, none of us were in the room, but I'm pretty sure she had this discussion with Kim Jong-un, came back to Biegun and told him it means the whole facility. So, there was something more going on. No one was scratching, at least Kim Jong-un wasn't scratching his head. And I suspect Chae Sun-hee wasn't confused, but she needed to get his approval.
Right.
And so on the second point, you're absolutely right. Kim Jong-un was the only person who could deal with the nuclear issue. But, he wasn't going to sit there and negotiate the specifics of dismantlement. I mean, that could be once he gave the order, this place has to be dismantled, then, the negotiators could do that. They could go ahead and negotiate it. And that's
Right.
what
Let me,
agreed
yeah.
framework too.
Yeah.
Um,
Let me just remind people, if you have questions, please put them in the Q&A, because I'm just going to talk to Joel until some of you jump on. But let me ask you another question, Joel, about sort of process, because it gets to divisions within the president's team at any point. I mean, whether it's Bush, Obama, Trump 1, Biden, Trump 2. I mean, just reading your account, it seems like the president would have members of their team who are just pushing in, completely different directions. I mean, I'll give an example from Obama 1. I mean, Obama makes this comment during the campaign. He's willing to talk to Kim Jong-un and other leaders. And then he's got, a Secretary of Defense who's saying, we're not going to pay for the same horse twice. We're not going to negotiate this. And that story can even be told about Trump 1 and Bolton. He's got a guy, Steve Biegun, who seems to understand that this is going to be a gradual step-for-step process. But then he's got, someone in the National Security Council who basically has no interest in negotiating at all and wants to kill it. That seems like a theme of your book, is, he's kind of contending forces within the administrations.
Yeah, let me start with Bolton, and I'll talk about Obama in a second. Yes, Trump picked Bolton. He knew that Bolton wasn't interested in diplomacy with North Korea. Bolton was really shocked because he came on board right as Trump was moving towards, a meeting in Singapore. But as far as I can tell, at least starting in the summer of 2018, when Steve Biegun came on board, Bolton was shut out. He was there. I don't know if he was paying attention, but I do know, and I got to be careful here, I do know his staff was not telling him what was going on, what Biegun was doing, which was developing a phased step-by-step approach to denuclearization. So Bolton was out of the loop. And even right before Hanoi, the beginning of next year, he was not part of the process. So he was cut out. In the Obama administration, uh, the Obama administration quickly shifted to strategic patience because of North Korea's WMD tests in 2009.
Right.
They quickly shifted in that direction. And, there were an isolated few people like Steve Bosworth, who was his special envoy, who were very interested in diplomacy. But they were isolated. They were a very small group. And indeed, the next year, the Obama administration established what was called the Deputy Small Group,
Yeah.
which short-circuited the decision-making process and only had a few people involved. And I know some of the advocates of engagement, they were excluded from it. So that was a further shunting the advocates of engagement to the side. And I'm going to make one last point here. As negotiations took off for the Leap Day deal, and Steve Bosworth was negotiating it, he was let go from the administration. Now, he said, people said, it's because he was not feeling well or it was because of his family. I don't think that was true. He was let go, and he was very unhappy about that. And it wasn't there's speculation that he was let go because the White House wanted to get rid of the most prominent proponent of engagement.
Yeah, let me bring Munsub in. Munsub, you've got your hand up. Why don't you jump in?
Hi, thanks, Steph. First of all, Stuart, thank you so much for joining us tonight and sharing the insights. I also had a misunderstanding about Hanoi, and then yeah, it got corrected. So I'm looking forward to reading the chapter of your book, that specific chapter of your book, after the end of the event. So my question is again, bringing us back to the Hanoi and then the potential the summit between the Kim and Trump under his second administration. So my question is, previously the Stephen, you talked about the constraint the North Korean the negotiators faced. But U.S. negotiators must have faced other type of constraint considering the domestic politics or alliance with the coordination with alliance, say the Japan and Korea. I wonder that ever played a role in the Hanoi summit, and with the change in the geopolitical situation, whether those constraints are going to play a role on the U.S. negotiator side, providing the certain type of the offers.
I found no evidence at all about domestic political constraints during the Hanoi summit, except, of course, there was that ongoing, I guess there was the hearing with Michael Cohen during the summit, Trump's former fixer. Now, people said, well, gee, that may have affected Trump. I don't know. I don't think that was the reason why the summit failed, or I don't think that was the reason why he walked out. So I didn't see evidence of domestic political constraints. And moreover, Biegun and Pompeo really dominated policymaking at that point. And they were pursuing a certain approach that Biegun had formulated the previous year. And even on the sanctions issue, Biegun wasn't constrained, and I'll tell you why I say that. Because he had in his back pocket a package of sanctions that could be lifted they were worth about $1 billion. He had it in his back pocket. He wasn't going to deploy that until the North Korean negotiator gave him something on the nuclear issue. But if the negotiator had given him something, Began could have pulled it out of his back pocket. That never happened, though, because the negotiators, they couldn't talk about nuclear issues. Oh, on the Trump administration, the second term, I feel like he's unconstrained by domestic politics. So some of us are not happy about that, but I think it's true.
Thank you. Steph, you're muted.
Yeah. I have my take on this question. I think some presidents would be constrained to secure something on the nuclear front, concrete. And certainly, I think Trump is capable of dancing around that issue, and taking something that would appear minor under a different setting and then using that to keep negotiations going.
Yeah.
But can I talk to you a little bit about the process following Singapore? Because for those who are listening and don't follow this history for a living, the sequence is that you have the Singapore summit, you get this broad statement of principles, which includes some reference to denuclearization, normalization of relations, security guarantees, peace regime, end of the armistice, and so on, indirectly. And then you have to negotiate that. And so something kind of goes wrong already in the fall of 2018, needless to say. You document that. Can you talk a little bit about that? Because it seems like the approach of the United States post Singapore was confusing for the North Koreans because they seemed to have felt that certain agreements had been reached in Singapore. And then they were surprised to find out that the message they were getting was quite different. And I think you tell that story well.
Well, yes, the Singapore Declaration was broad statements, feel-good statements. But what happened was, after Singapore, Trump thought that it meant North Korea was going to give up its nuclear weapons right away. He thought they agreed to denuclearization, they're going to ship their weapons out, and that'll be it. So, if I guess it was in July 2018, Mike Pompeo, who was Secretary of State then, went off to North Korea, and he was given a position to demand or ask for 25 nuclear weapons to be shipped out of North Korea to start that process. And he had fallback positions. He could fall back to 5, he could fall back to 1. But on the way there, he modified the whole approach. He got rid of that approach, and he asked essentially for a declaration of North Korea's nuclear facilities, which they weren't about to give. So the whole idea of complete denuclearization just crashed at that point. And that's when Steve Biegun came on board and changed the approach to step by step. And by the fall, he was getting some traction, because in the fall, there was the summit between South Korea and North Korea that, had a good result.
Yeah, the second summit, the Pyongyang summit, yeah.
And there was Biegun, and Pompeo visited North Korea, met with Kim Jong-un, and it was a very good meeting. And so Kim even seemed to hint at that he was willing to offer more than Yeonbyeon. He was willing, he talked about Yeonbyeon and more. And that sort of developed the theme in a letter that he had just sent Trump about he was willing to dismantle the Nuclear Weapons Institute, which many thought was their nuclear weapons lab. So things seemed to be on the right track then. The rest of the year, nothing happened, and it's hard to say why. But the North Koreans, they didn't follow through on moving forward with a summit. And then at the end of the year, they finally did.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I'll just make one comment on the Pyongyang summit and see if you agree. I thought it was surprising that the North Koreans were willing to talk to the South Koreans and even mention anything about nuclear weapons at all, because they've historically not wanted to carry that conversation with Seoul. Um, Joel, can I get you to jump ahead a little bit? I know this is sort of speculative, but we've got a very interesting set of questions here in the queue that have to just do with the strengthening of China-North Korea relations. They seem to be unfrozen a little bit. And then, of course, Kim Jong-un holding up his hand when the invasion of Ukraine took place and capitalizing on that moment. And the question really, if I can sort of translate it and condense it, is Kim Jong-un currently in a position where he doesn't really need the cooperation of the United States? That he can just simply go back to the fold of his brethren, his Russian and Chinese brethren.
Oh, absolutely. I think that's absolutely true. And, it's very clear to me that if the war in Ukraine ended tomorrow, that wouldn't mean the Russia and North Korea connection would end as well. I mean, it's a very deep and continuing connection, and it's not going to end. And that's a big problem, because it complicates our ability to conduct diplomacy. And it's one of the things I don't think Trump sees. If we want to start a diplomatic process with North Korea again, we're going to need China and Russia to, say, yes, this is a good thing, particularly Russia and particularly Putin. I mean, I think everyone focuses on how Russia might help North Korea develop its weapons of mass destruction. I'm not so sure about that, but I do know the Russians will help them with modernizing their conventional forces and their defense industries. And that's a big deal because as everyone knows, North Korea hasn't modernized its conventional forces in decades. And that's changing dramatically. And you mentioned China. China's still part of the mix, but I think Russia is really key here.
Oh, that's interesting. Let's find something we can disagree on. I disagree on that. I mean, in the sense, I think that Russia's lost. But I think that, I was wondering if in the course of your track two talks, you had chance to hear from what the Chinese were thinking, because I'm still struck by the sequence of events. I mean, you had the Mar-a-Lago summit in April 2017, and it seemed at that point that Xi Jinping was sort of fed up with, with Kim Jong-un and willing to support, very stringent UN Security Council sanctions. But then once the summit process started, it's almost like China almost was immediately backing up, it seemed to me. I mean, there you had 5 summits with Kim Jong-un in the course of a little over a year. Did you sense that the Chinese policy was sort of shifting over the course of the engagement period?
Yes, I mean it as you know, over 30 years, it shifts one direction that's more supportive of the United States. It shifts away from that. So if you want to talk about, the Trump administration and after Mar-a-Lago, and yes, they were supportive for sanctions. They continued a dialogue with the United States on how to deal with the collapse of North Korea.
Yeah, that was a really interesting in the book. I did not know that because they've been so resistant to having those conversations.
Right. And Obama started that at the end of his administration, and it was part of Susan Rice's initiative, her China play. But I think the shift you're talking about was as US and South Korean summitry happened, the Chinese, I think, just felt like they were out of the ball game, and they needed to get into the diplomatic ball game. And so you saw Xi meeting with Kim Jong-un. I think in those meetings, he was encouraging Kim not to move forward too quickly with
Yeah.
diplomacy with the United States. So to me, that shift, it made sense from the Chinese perspective.
Yeah, interesting. Let me bring in Rosie O'Neill, one of our students. Rosie, do you want to ask Joel a question?
Yes. First of all, thank you for the presentation and letting us join your conversation. It is very insightful. And I have one question about Mr. Witt mentioning about um, the having another summit between the US and North Korea doesn't seem like a good idea because North Korea has now strengthened their allies with China and Russia, and we cannot pick up where we have left in 2017, and we have a different advisor for the administration. So based on those comments, I am curious if you can share more about your insights, thoughts on what would be the stance the US likely to take with North Korea during the current administration, and would the North Korea would be interested in another summit with the US? Like you said, Kim Jong-un has strong allies with Russia and China. I'm curious if you have any thoughts on this.
I mean, the only person who can answer the question on the US stance is Donald Trump, because no one else is really studying it, thinking about it in the administration, as far as I can tell. The Trump administration is a very different animal from previous administrations. I don't believe there's a decision-making process. In the previous administrations, there's always the working level interagency group, and the process goes up the chain of the command to the NSC and the senior level group. I don't know if this is true for other issues, but I think on North Korea there is no process. And that leads me to believe, it's just going to be what President Trump thinks he should do. And I'm not sure he's well informed enough to, really know the current situation. On Kim Jong-un, I think he could easily say, yeah, let's meet and try out some of his ideas on Trump that would serve Kim's interests, but not the United States interests, not South Korea, not Japan. And I mentioned one of those ideas, like start withdrawing troops from South Korea. So, and for Kim, that's great, because his objectives nowadays are not to have a serious engagement with the United States, but it's an engagement based on geopolitics and serving what his allies are interested in and what he's interested in, which is pushing the United States out of Northeast Asia.
Well, Joel, the conversation's really been interesting. Let me close with one of the actors in this drama that we haven't talked much about, which is South Korea. And let me introduce it by asking you a question. One interpretation of Hanoi was that Moon Jae-in's effect was actually adverse because he was overselling to Kim Jong-un what the Americans would deliver, and he was overselling to the Americans what Kim Jong-un would deliver. Do you think that there's any truth in that? And do you think that South Korea could play a more constructive role, or do you think it's really just out of this picture generally because it has to be bilateral? How do you interpret the South Korean role?
Well, yeah. So, there are a number of Americans who were in the Trump administration who blame South Korea for the failure of Hanoi for precisely the reason you're mentioning. Because, when Kim Jong-un would meet President Moon, he would ask for President Moon's advice on how to deal with Donald Trump and the United States. And so there was a lot of focus on the Yonbyon nuclear facility there. So it's quite possible Kim thought going in that, oh, Trump's going to agree to this. And Trump would have agreed to it if Kim hadn't demanded so much sanctions lifting.
Right.
So yeah, there are a lot of people who blame the South Koreans, but the bottom line is, I think Kim Jong-un's approach would have been step by step anyway. I mean, that's what his grandfather did. That's what his father did. And that's what he was going to do, start with Yonbyon.
Yeah.
So, it's not as if President Moon convinced him to do that, but he probably reinforced his desire to do that. As for today, I don't see there's much room for a role for South Korea, given the state of North-South relations and Kim's hostility towards South Korea.
Yeah, well, obviously the major changes, that came in 2024 with respect to North-South relations have seem to have dampened that possibility. But let me close with one last question, because I think it was one of those most striking things about the book to me was just how dense the network of informal connections are between North Korea and the rest of the world. I mean, you've attended Track 2 meetings in Europe, in Asia, in the United States, and so on. Can you say anything about the status of those networks now? Are they basically completely shut down? I know, because of personal connections that there is some, communication through the New York Channel with some Americans, maybe you. But what else is going on that front? Is there anything that would suggest that the North Koreans are, willing to continue to participate in conversations of that sort?
I may not be as informed as you are, but my bottom line is they're not open to the kinds of Track 2 meetings we had in the past, which, as you could see from the book, were pretty detailed, pretty substantive, and it was brainstorming.
Yeah.
But nowadays, no, I don't think they're open to it, just as they're not interested in engagement. So it's a reflection of that overall policy.
Fantastic, Joel. I mean, that was such an interesting conversation. The book is Fallout. It's available in both hardback and electronic form. I want to thank our events people, Curtis Bruno, Rosie O'Neill for sitting in, Mun-Sub Lee, who directs the Korea Pacific program. And Joel, I'm really sorry we couldn't do this in person. It was just the timing around Thanksgiving and the end of the year. But I really hope that in the future, if you have a chance to come out, maybe spend a couple days with us, we can put you together with some of our students and you can talk about these issues in more depth.
Great. I'd like to do that.
Thanks very much. Good night, everyone.